At 1:21 a.m., a Boeing 777 disappeared from radar. But 60 seconds before that, everything was completely normal. The flight attendants were finishing their last safety checks. The passengers were settling in, adjusting pillows, closing their eyes for the 6-hour overnight flight to Beijing. The pilots had just made routine contact with air traffic control. Everything was on schedule. Everything was exactly where it should be. Then the transponder went off. Not a crash, not a distress call, not a single warning light on any radar screen on Earth. The plane didn't fall. It didn't explode. It simply stopped being visible, and then kept flying for 7 more hours in complete silence, carrying 239 people toward a destination that nobody on the ground could identify, track, or reach. Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 is the greatest aviation mystery of the modern era. Dozens of countries searched for it. Hundreds of millions of dollars were spent. The most advanced satellite technology on Earth was pointed at the ocean. The plane has never been found. But here's what makes it truly disturbing. This wasn't a mechanical failure. Someone in that cockpit made a decision. A deliberate, calculated, irreversible decision. And nobody knows why. To understand MH370, you need to understand how routine that flight was supposed to be. Malaysia Airlines was a well-respected carrier with a strong safety record. Flight MH370 operated regularly between Kuala Lumpur and Beijing. A standard overnight route. 6 hours. Nothing unusual. The aircraft was a Boeing 777-200ER, one of the most reliable commercial planes ever built. Over 20 years of operation, the 777 had an almost perfect safety record. It was the plane airlines trusted most on long-haul routes. The passengers were ordinary travelers, mostly Chinese nationals heading home, business people, tourists, a group of painters returning from an exhibition, families. The youngest passenger was 2 years old. The captain was Zahari Ahmad Shah, 53 years old. Over 18,000 hours of flight experience. A veteran of Malaysia Airlines for more than 3 decades. By every professional measure, one of the most qualified pilots in the fleet. He was known for being calm, methodical, and deeply passionate about aviation. He had a full flight simulator at home that he used regularly in his spare time. At 12:41 a.m. on March 8, 2014, MH370 pushed back from the gate at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. The weather was clear. The systems were functioning normally. The crew completed their checks. The plane lifted off on schedule. Everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. And that's exactly what makes what happened next so impossible to explain. The first 40 minutes of the flight were completely normal. Air traffic control tracked the plane. The onboard systems were transmitting. The crew made standard radio calls. Passengers were settling in for the night. At 1:07 a.m., the ACARS system, which automatically transmits technical data from the aircraft to the airline, sent its last scheduled update. Everything normal. At 1:19 a.m., the co-pilot made the final radio transmission from the cockpit. Routine. Calm. Standard handover language to Vietnamese air traffic controllers who would take responsibility for the flight as it entered their airspace. 38 seconds later, the transponder went dark. No warning. No distress call. No explanation. The signal that identifies the aircraft to civilian radar simply stopped. And here's what made it worse. Turning off a transponder mid-flight is not something that happens by accident. There is a specific switch in the cockpit. It requires a deliberate action by someone who knows exactly what they are doing. Someone turned it off on purpose. But here's what should have been impossible. The plane didn't disappear completely. Malaysian military radar, which tracks objects independently of transponders for defense purposes, continued picking up an unidentified aircraft. And what it showed next stunned the officers watching the screen. Instead of continuing northeast toward Beijing, the aircraft had turned hard left, back across the Malaysian peninsula, over the Strait of Malacca, toward the Indian Ocean. A complete reversal of its filed flight plan, executed precisely, professionally, at cruising altitude. Not the erratic movement of a plane in distress. The controlled, deliberate turn of a plane being flown by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The military watched it happen and did not scramble jets. They assumed it was a civilian aircraft with some kind of technical issue. It was almost 2 a.m. The decision was made to monitor, not intercept. That decision cost the world its last chance to know where MH370 went. By 2:22 a.m., the aircraft had left the range of Malaysian military radar entirely. It crossed into the Indian Ocean and vanished from every known tracking system on Earth. But not from space. And this is where it gets strange in a way that nobody anticipated. A British satellite communications company called Inmarsat had a satellite positioned over the Indian Ocean. The aircraft's communication system was still powered on, not transmitting data, but automatically sending hourly handshake signals to the satellite. Electronic pings, the satellite equivalent of a heartbeat. They carried no location data, no voice, no information, just proof that the plane still existed. The last ping was received at 8:19 a.m., more than 7 hours after the transponder went dark. 7 hours of silent flight over one of the most remote stretches of ocean on Earth, with 239 people on board and no contact with the outside world. Inmarsat engineers worked for days on the ping data. Using the angle of each signal relative to the satellite, they calculated a probable flight path. 2 corridors, one heading north over Central Asia, one heading south deep into the southern Indian Ocean. The northern corridor would have taken the plane over populated areas where radar systems would almost certainly have detected it. The southern corridor led into empty ocean, thousands of kilometers from the nearest land, in waters so deep and so remote that searching them was almost beyond the limits of what technology could do. The search went south. Here's what the investigation found, and what it couldn't explain. The turn was not a malfunction. Every system on that plane that went dark, the transponder, the ACARS, the secondary radar signature, was disabled in a specific sequence. Not simultaneously, the way a catastrophic failure would knock everything out at once. Sequentially, one, by someone who understood the aircraft systems well enough to know exactly which switch did what, and in what order. And here's what made it worse. A flight simulator analysis conducted after the disappearance found that someone had run a simulation on Captain Zahari's home simulator months before the flight. A simulation of a long flight over the southern Indian Ocean, with fuel exhaustion, ending in open water. The simulation files had been deleted. Investigators recovered fragments of them. Zahari was never conclusively proven to be responsible. There is no confession, no note, no clear motive. His family and colleagues have consistently defended his character. Malaysian authorities investigated his personal life, his finances, his relationships, his politics. Nothing definitive emerged. The co-pilot, Farik Abdul Hamid, 27 years old, newly engaged, by all accounts enthusiastic about his career, has never been credibly linked to any deliberate act. The 227 passengers had no known connections to each other, no shared profile that would explain a coordinated action. 2 of them were traveling on stolen passports, a detail that initially seemed significant and turned out to be connected to immigration fraud, not terrorism. Every theory that has been proposed, mechanical failure, pilot action, hijacking, hypoxia event, remote interference, has gaps that the available evidence cannot fill. What the evidence does show is this. Someone flew that plane for 7 hours after turning off its ability to be tracked. Someone flew it in a direction with no destination. Someone flew it until it ran out of fuel somewhere over the southern Indian Ocean. And then it went down in waters so deep, so vast, and so far from shipping lanes that finding it has defeated every attempt made so far. 3 impacts, all still unresolved. The human cost first. 239 people. Gone. No bodies recovered. No wreckage found at the crash site. Families of passengers spent years in a specific kind of grief that doesn't have a clean name, not knowing, with legal certainty, what happened. Some families refused to accept death certificates. Some hired their own investigators. Some still do not believe the plane went into the ocean. Because without physical proof, the mind goes to other places. A small amount of debris eventually washed up on shores across the Indian Ocean. A flaperon on Reunion Island in 2015, fragments of interior panels on beaches in Mozambique and Tanzania. Enough to confirm the aircraft went down somewhere in that ocean. Not enough to tell anyone where, or why, or what happened in the cockpit in the hours between 1:19 a.m. and the end. The aviation cost second. MH370 exposed a gap in global aviation tracking that nobody had publicly acknowledged before. In 2014, Commercial aircraft flying over oceans could disappear from radar coverage entirely for hours at a time, and the systems in place were not capable of finding them. The flight triggered a complete overhaul of international aviation tracking standards. Since 2021, all commercial aircraft are required to broadcast their position every minute. The specific regulation exists because of MH370. 239 people died, in part, because nobody had required the technology that already existed to be used. The mystery costs third, and this one is still open. The official search, the largest and most expensive underwater search in aviation history, covered 120,000 square kilometers of the southern Indian Ocean seabed. It found nothing related to MH370. A second search, funded privately, covered additional areas. Also nothing. A third search was announced and conducted between 2018 and 2022 by an American ocean exploration company. Fragments. Interior pieces. No flight recorders. No fuselage. No answers. The black boxes, the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, are almost certainly somewhere on the floor of the Indian Ocean, in water up to 4,000 meters deep, in an area the size of a small country. If they are ever found, they may answer everything. Or they may have been damaged beyond recovery. Or the cockpit voice recorder, which only captures the last 2 hours of audio, may have recorded nothing useful from the hours that actually matter. We may never know what happened in that cockpit. We may never know what was said, or decided, or felt in the 7 hours between the last radio call and the end. 239 people flew into the night over the South China Sea and never came back. And the world, with all its satellites and search ships and underwater drones and resources, looked as hard as it knew how to look, and came back empty. Some disappearances don't have endings. Some questions don't close. Some planes just go dark at 1:21 a.m. and keep flying until they don't. What moment in history do you think the world never truly recovered from? Tell me in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.